Hello, everyone. Welcome to Laser Focus. This is the deep dive pop culture podcast from Nerdist. My name's Kyle Anderson. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so excited. This week, we're going to be talking big giant monsters in the lead up to Godzilla, Kong, the New Empire. And who better to speak about monsters with than somebody who literally hosts a show called MONSTRUM. Host of MONSTRUM, writer, host, and degree holder in many things, Dr. Emily Zarka. Hello and welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. First up, when did you, well, let's start at the beginning. For people who don't know what MONSTRUM is, I can't imagine anyone who listens to this doesn't, but what is MONSTRUM and how did you get involved in that?
Yeah, so MONSTRUM is my educational YouTube show with PBS, hosted now on the Storied platform. It's basically a show that looks at human history as monster history. I dreamed up the idea when I was actually a PhD student and was really just trying to think of ways that I could get what I love to do, which is research and talk about monsters, because I think that they can open us up to some like really intense, difficult conversations. How could I do that outside of just a university classroom or a monograph book that only so many people in like my niche field are going to read? And I pitched the show to PBS, and I know one of my things was I want to do for monsters what Anthony Bourdain did for food.
Nice.
So thank you. So show that, fear and monstrosity and storytelling actually bonds us together as humans to try to create more connections and more understanding for a better world.
And you've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's crazy to think about. We've been on YouTube since 2019 and are currently on our 6th season of MONSTRUM, which is surreal to think of, how it started as this funny little Frankensteinian dream in my head, and now it's become what it is. And I'm so grateful for PBS and my production company Spotson for just being great people to work with. And we care about education and high quality content, and that's what MONSTRUM does.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a huge long playlist of videos. Anybody out there, I'll link it in the show notes so people can watch it. But the first thing, what I like about MONSTRUM is that you talk about, like folkloric creatures in the same kind of with the same reverence as you do like movie monsters or like famous, I guess, like Frankenstein or Dracula and stuff like that. What was that always the goal going in? Was it going to be like let's look at the world's worth of monsters, or was it specifically like Frankenstein and like the more kind of, I guess, well-known Western ones?
So my PhD is in literature, so of course I knew that those kind of literary iconic monsters and cinematography type monsters were going to show up. But yeah, one of the main tenets of the show is I didn't want to just do Western white people monsters. That's not something that I think there's enough about that. Let's put it that way. I wanted to, again, try to show connection between people. And part of that means talking about some of the lesser publicly known monsters, or at least to, Western white communities. So that's always been one of the tenets of the show. And I've been, again, fortunate enough that there's so many cool monsters in folklore and in pop culture that I don't think I'm running out of monsters to cover anytime soon.
Yeah, and what I love too, like, you learn about, vampires or something like that, which is like there's the Dracula version of vampires, but then there's like every, China has the hopping vampires, or like there's other, and werewolves too, like shape-shifting monsters, or human monsters kind of controlled by the moon and stuff like that. It's really interesting to spot like this is where this all came from, or I guess like it all kind of spawned from the same like, obviously different parts of the world, but from the same like thing, being like the moon or like undeadness and stuff like that.
Yes, the undead hold a very special place in my heart. That was some of the first horror movies I remember watching were zombie movies. And my dissertation, and officially my specialty, is actually in the undead in Gothic literature.
What a specialty to have. Oh my gosh.
I know, it's so crazy every time I say it, even now, which is wild. So I like every culture that I've found that buries their dead has some kind of undead monster in, because I think we're inherently freaked out about death and the finality of it. And then again, the possibility that it's not final is really terrifying. But yeah, I love to find those threads. If it's like you said, the moon, or if it's, fear of some of our natural like predator species, or weird fossils that were discovered, or just things that, parents did to try to keep their kids close to home and, in safe environments. Again, I think that kind of connection is really powerful and inspiring, and not something people want to think about with horror and monsters. So if I can make the world a better place a little bit by making it a little bit of a weirder place, I'm all here for it.
What are some of the monsters that you've learned about that have, like, maybe you didn't know that much about, that you're like, oh, this one is super cool, I want everyone to know about this one?
I will preach about the Manananggal forever. I think the Manananggal is fascinating. So it's a Filipino vampiric monster. So a self-segmenting female monster who appears like a beautiful, normal woman during the day, and then at night goes into the groves and just detaches her upper torso from her body, grows bat wings, and flies around with her intestines dangling out, sucking the viscera from people, particularly pregnant women. And I thought that was so bizarre in the best way possible, and also so incredibly specific that I was like, there has to be something with this one. And when I did my research on the Manananggal, I found a really interesting connection between, it's kind of not really a spoiler because I feel like this is something that happens across the world, when the Spanish came and colonized the Philippines, that there was a shift in how women, and particularly female midwives and shamans, were viewed and demonized. And part of that is why the Manananggal was created. And that's just such a cool little like locus moment of history that I like being able to talk about the Manananggal. But there's so many good ones. Even things like big bugs or monster bugs. That was an episode that was really surprising to me, because how much I learned for that. And so that's hopefully what I think comes across in Monstrum, is I get to learn alongside my audience in a lot of ways while I'm doing the research, because I do research and write every episode. And that's something that I'm so grateful for, because that's what I love to do. I mean, I'm an educator, but I think part of being an educator is being a student constantly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, and that's so much of the fun, I think, is like you learn something. It's like, well, I got to tell everybody about this, because it's like, that's, your exuberance comes through on the show.
Good.
You mentioned, a lot of cultures have fear of the dead. And I find that I'm like putting my finger on stuff like cosmic horror is a thing I think is very scary, but also like fear of the uncanny, which is like, which is what a dead body effectively is like, it's something that seems every day, but is somehow off. And what are some of those kind of things that kind of scare you, or like get to the heart of things that are, what makes you afraid?
Speaking of the uncanny, I have a extremely healthy fear of robots. I think
so at this point.
Thank you. I've read, and people are always like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you clearly haven't read enough science fiction or watched enough horror movies, because, hey, I mean, this comes into play with like Mecha Godzilla and stuff too. I just think that robots are terrifying and AI is terrifying. And I read iRobot at like a really young age, so that was just like in my brain. Ironically, I used to be terrified of vampires as a child. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I decided I wanted to study them so much, is to learn about them. So yeah, definitely robots freak me out. The other thing that freaks me out that isn't necessarily a monster is the ocean. I actually am very afraid of giant squid, and just all the weird creatures that linger there that we probably don't even know about all of them. We know we don't know all about them. There's something so surreal that we have this like seemingly infinite space on our own planet that we don't know that much about. So I think that's really terrifying and cool. So I love when horror and pop culture play with those fears. And honestly, I like being scared. And I think that's something that a lot of fans of the horror genre feel deep in their souls. It's that we want to be scared just a little bit, just enough. And I love that.
Yeah, I think I have the same fear of the ocean, and also big stuff in the ocean. And it's weird when that comes out, because even something like, have you ever been to the whatever museum it is in New York? There's only the one, but I think it's the big Natural History Museum in New York, and you walk into that room and there's the huge giant skeleton of the blue whale, I believe, or like a model of the blue whale, I forget. But it's just like, even just that, just knowing that is that much larger than us, like it made me feel really weird. And I think that there's because the ocean is so vast and so unknown, like that is where, like, I think you can mine a lot of good horror, like film ideas from that as well. But like, it feels so alien. So like something from outer space or something from the ocean, it feels like on a level, in terms of like, tentacles and weird stuff. Like
Yeah.
there's no surprise that so much of Lovecraft stuff is like fish
Yep.
based because it is
Yes.
pretty scary.
No, I totally agree with that. And back before I realized how problematic it was, I swam with dolphins as like a
Mm.
in middle school, and I remember thinking it was so cool. And the second, like touching the dolphin, I was instantly terrified because it was just pure muscle, and I felt like it was so smart, and it could just kill me in an instant if it really wanted to, and slam me up against the wall. And I've have a very healthy fear of the ocean and everything that's in it. So yeah, the possibility that there could be even crazier things than that we know about that maybe want to eat us or do something to us is terrifying.
Yeah. Well, that actually, that segues very nicely into our main topic, which is Godzilla and Kong and kaiju. Because that's one of the hallmarks of Godzilla is, I mean, it's changed somewhat, but like the
Mhm.
current slate of Godzilla in movies is like, he is there to protect the earth, not necessarily humans. And so it's like,
Mhm.
knowing that something that large just kind of doesn't care that we exist is also like that gets to the heart of a lot of things. But you had an episode a few years ago about Godzilla and Mothra.
I
We'll talk
did.
about Mothra in a minute, but what were some of the interesting things you learned about Godzilla and where and like his origins and like
Mhm.
since then, like has anything about the way people kind of depict kaiju kind of made its way into your brain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think although I always knew that Godzilla was connected to World War II and the
Hmm.
atomic bomb, I didn't really realize how much Gojira, the original film, is like about Japanese mourning. I mean, like there's some really extended scenes of like a funeral and people having to leave their homes, and Godzilla doesn't even pop up until like 20 minutes into the movie, and we don't even see him that much. And I think obviously because Japan was still processing World War II and the use of atomic bombs in their own country. And it's explicitly talked about in the original film. And when they actually moved the film to the US and like had it dubbed and did all these other crazy things to it, they cut like 30 minutes of the original film that directly talks about the US and the war and the use of the atomic bomb. And I think, of course, given the US's role in that, that makes sense to a degree that it was, taken when it was at first shown here. But I think learning about that history and sort of the Japanese perspective was something really fascinating to me. And the other thing I did learn, which brings us to Mothra to a degree, is Mothra was recently voted like the most popular kaiju monster in Japan. And I think that's fantastic. And I know you're a fan of Mothra
Oh
yourself, and we
yes.
won't get too much ahead of that. But I just think Godzilla and kaiju picked up on this like really specific moment in history with the effects of World War II and nuclear energy and atomic bombs, and people were just freaked out about it. And we do see that a little bit in the US as well with
Hmm.
like the big bug sort of science fiction and horror subgenre with like them. But the perspective is super different. So Gojira is definitely about Japan trying to process having people die from a nuclear weapon. And then them is kind of more about like the scientists and the people in the US, like not knowing what the effects of that kind of testing are going to do. So I love when we can find two completely different cultures, perspectives on like a historical event and how they've grown in different ways. And interestingly, Godzilla is the thing that's kind of lingered. And I think that the best Godzilla movies um, are ones that actually serve as social commentary to some degree.
Oh yeah, I completely agree, and it's really interesting to like it. Anybody who wants to do research into like post-war Japan and just kind
Mhm.
of how much the U.S. The terms of surrender for Japan were so harsh on the Japanese people, and so I think by 1954, when the movie was made, I think we were still effectively an occupying nation in Japan. I think,
Mhm.
um, and just they were a defeated nation, and that is
Yep.
like there's so much great art that comes out of that, and not just that's not obviously a reason for it to have happened, but um uh that is all just sort of like, yeah, we lost, it was our fault kind of
Mhm.
thing. And it's a really fascinating thing to watch Godzilla, which is like it was the nuclear testing and all that and that caused Godzilla, but it is still like affecting, like it is attacking Japan specifically. Like
Mhm.
there's that element of like we kind of brought this on ourselves, even though it was much more like the US actually, devastated. And we can also say that like
Yeah.
Japan is like the only modern nation that has actually suffered apocalyptic,
Mhm.
effects with the two H bombs and everything like that.
Mhm.
Anyway, I find that stuff really, really
Yeah,
interesting.
me too. And I also think what a lot of people don't know, and I didn't until I researched the episode, is that in March of the year the movie came out, 1954, a tuna boat called the Lucky Dragon was actually caught in U.S. H-bomb testing, and a lot of the fishermen suffered from radioactive poisoning. And this Gojira opens with like a really similar scene of like a big flash
Mm,
and like a fishing boat, and so it's very obvious that the creators of Godzilla were directly speaking to the continued Japanese experience with U.S. relations and with science. That's the other thing I think people forget about the main plot, is that there's a scientist who's considered, of course, mad scientist or crazy,
mm,
which is definitely a thread we see in the Godzilla movies, even in the most recent ones. This He has a weapon that he's developed that he knows can save them from Godzilla, but is terrified to actually use it because of seeing the effects of the atomic bomb and being like, I don't think anyone should have this. And then he actually, dies at the end and destroys all of his research so that no one can replicate it. And I think that's also a really interesting perspective, looking back at World War II.
yeah. And obviously we have the newest film that
Mhm.
well, not the new one that's about to come out, but the newest one that just came out, which is Godzilla -1, which is like sets it further back a little bit, but it's still
Mhm.
kind of all about like, again, those effects and like what I thought that movie did really well, among everything. That movie's great, but
Yeah.
um was like no one else is going to help them. It's like
Mhm.
Japan is literally on an island unto itself, and they have to kind of band together, but they're not allowed to use weaponry, like all the stuff that is true of what they were forced to do after the
Mhm.
war. Um, and let me ask you your opinion on this, because like
Mhm.
that movie and the original and a few ones throughout, like Godzilla 85 and
Mhm.
things like that, Godzilla is an out and out like force of destruction and evil, quote unquote. But very quickly, Godzilla started to become like a good guy. What do you make of that in terms of like the storytelling aspect and just kind of what that meant to the character, kind of?
Mhm. I think from a more broad storytelling aspect, like you want to vote for the hero or the anti-hero a little bit more than you want to vote for the villain. So I think making Godzilla the protector against all, of the world or humanity from all these other kaiju, is and like space kaiju and like crazy stuff,
Yeah.
makes sense from a storytelling perspective, and frankly from like a marketing perspective and like consumerism. There's a lot more merchandise to sell if you want to be the hero, I guess, to a
Mm.
degree. So I would rant forever about how Mothra needs her own modern movie
Oh
or
yeah.
English movie. I need to see more of her. I need her. She's great. I think the world needs her. She's benevolent and great. Which I guess brings me back to Godzilla.
Yeah.
And I think that his character development, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of speaks in my mind to humanity's relationship and understanding of nature and of prehistoric creatures and of apex predators. I mean, that's something that we see a lot in the new movies, as you mentioned, is that Godzilla doesn't really care about people. He cares about protecting his territory and his habitat. And we see him, team up with King Kong. And I think Kong has a completely different perspective.
Mm.
Skull Island established that Kong is a protector of humans, period. Very much in the same line as Mothra. So I would love to see them team up. That's the movie that I want. And I actually really did like Skull Island, which I can talk about reasons for that. But I do think Godzilla is just cool. He looks
Yeah.
cool. He's got cool powers. I mean, he's the big boss, and usually we're so used to seeing the big boss get taken down and defeated, and seeing sort of this prehistoric dinosaur type creature like rise again and again, I think speaks to our love of um ancient creatures, but also us like rooting for the underdog. Like we know Godzilla is going to win eventually, and there's something formulaic and like pleasing about that. But I
Mm.
think that I feel like Godzilla's gotten more feral or like return to nature and less from some of the campy stuff we see, largely in the 80s and the 90s. And I think that's because we, as a species, humans, are increasingly realizing that not only have we destroyed the planet, but that there's a very real potential for it to be fighting back against us. And I think Godzilla right now, currently, is literally the embodiment of that. He doesn't care about people. He cares about his home, and he's going to do whatever he needs to make sure that he survives and screw all the other species. And I think that that's actually something that we all have and humanity also has, like, deep within us that we don't want to recognize. So maybe Godzilla serves as sort of a scapegoat that allows us to see that play out in a way that's a little more digestible.
Yeah, I think I think that digestibility is because, like, if you there's a version, and I guess Shin Godzilla, the one from 2016, came very
Mhm.
close to it being like, this is kind of, it's almost so cynical and downbeat that it's like, I mean, it's a good movie, but it loses a lot of what makes Godzilla, I think, really interesting, which is
Mhm.
that it is a creature unto itself. It is not just a force of evil. Like it is just, it's doing what it's doing, and sources of, radiation and stuff have caused him to become this.
Mhm.
Whereas I think Shin Godzilla was specifically just about how Japan was bad at dealing with the Fukushima meltdown and everything like that, which
Mhm.
it served a very good purpose at the time, and it is a good movie. But you watch something like -1, and it's like, okay, this is more
Yeah.
like my version of what I like Godzilla to be.
Yeah.
Um, Evil or good. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what it ought to be, is just sort of nature. But yeah, I like the nature
Yes.
fighting back kind of aspect
Yeah,
of
I
it.
think that's what I think the best just Godzilla texts in general, because I think there's some really interesting things that, like, comics have done and manga
Mm,
of or more in my mind, at least modern adaptations directly tying Godzilla again back to these, like, the Japanese experience and to these historical events. And I think that when the movies can do that, that's when they're successful. And that's one of the reasons that I like Skull Island with Kong, because it's directly connected to the Vietnam War and that experience. And I think that when people like to say, like, oh, it's just like an action movie, or, you just want to see Godzilla and Kong fight, and, like, yeah, I want to see that, but I also want it to mean something, and I want there to
mhm.
be like a larger plot there. But maybe that's just the literature professor in me coming out.
No, and I think, like, there's much more room for Kong to do that. I think, I mean, a lot of it is that Kong, apes are inherently more,
Hmm.
since they are so closely related to humans, they, like, we can read more humanity into them.
Hmm.
um but yeah, Kong Skull Island might still be my favorite of the more recent ones, just because of all that, and the Vietnam aspect is very interesting, and it still ties back to World War II, because there's the
Hmm.
guy who's been there since World War II and everything like that, or Korean War, I forget which one's which. Um but yeah, but Kong has absolutely changed a lot over the years, and obviously there's fewer Kong films. But your episode that hasn't come out yet, as we record this, about King Kong, kind of goes
Hmm.
into the early, um, the first film, and kind of, at the time, it was kind of like, adventure movies kind of meant going into the dark, primitive, quote unquote, I'm using heavy air
Hmm.
quotes here. But yeah, talk about, I guess, your research into the King
Yeah.
Kong experience and all the other 8 movies that came around.
Yeah, so Monstrum is coming out with a two-part King Kong sort of run. That was the result of me realizing there's just way too much to talk about. And
Right.
part of that is because Kong has such a complex racial history in the US and actually globally. So the first episode that we're looking at does look at the original 1933 film, which is, we're coming out of the Great Depression. The Hollywood industry is, like, struggling in general, and we see both of those things as a thorough line throughout that original film. But we also see, of course, this incredibly problematic, like, sexualized relationship between Kong, who is this black muscular body who's forcibly taken from his home and brought to the U.S. for spectacle, alongside a white woman who, of course, is, conceptualized as this, untainable beauty. And I think it, especially during the time period when the movie was made and shown, the racial implications would not have been lost on the audience at all. And I think that's something that, as in the 21st century, might want to, like, turn our nose up at, or, be like, oh, well, it was a different time period. And people will say that as well with the Jackson remake, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
Oh yeah.
That, like, oh, well, of course they're going to have actors in blackface, which is ridiculous because that was what was done in the time period. And I think that that's doing a disservice to history and also to humanity and how far we have come. Obviously, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with racial relationships in the United States and elsewhere across the globe. But I think that ignoring the 1933 history is ridiculous. And as you mentioned, the thing people didn't know about was when King Kong came out, and I will say it was incredibly successful, especially that it came out during the Great Depression and still made a ton of money. Theaters were sold out and packed. It was incredibly well received. Part of that because of the incredible stop motion and special effects work of Willis Harold O'Brien. So I don't want to completely, outshine some of the things that the movie did do and did very well. But even the two filmmakers had experience in this genre, and there was a sort of sub-horror genre at the time that was all about very it's like crazy to even say, like as a 21st century person, of Black people in different parts of the world literally offering women as sexual sacrifice to gorillas and to apes. And there was this like weird faux documentary about that like has like miscegenation things going on there. And it was one of the most successful movies the year it came out. And these documentary films that were showing different parts of the world to US audiences and making it seem like this was backwards and lesser than and problematic, and like all the indigenous and native peoples were violent and stupid, and all of that was like very common at the time. And I didn't find any research that explicitly stated that, maybe because no one wanted to admit it, but I think that the success of some of those racist films was one of the things that allowed King Kong to happen, to be made in the first place. And I think that it's really interesting that the original filmmaker, one of them, said that he wanted to make Kong to show how this like natural body is able to top the Empire State Building, which was considered the architectural like marvel of the time. And part of me is like, okay, yeah, that's definitely there, but there's also a lot of other stuff there. And the way Kong has been dealt with in pop culture since then is super fascinating. And I like to think that Kong is, I personally think that it wasn't until Skull Island that we were able to move the farthest we've gotten so far, taking Kong out of that problematic context. Because I think a lot of the other modernizations or remakes try to be modern and like try to be more positive and like post-colonial, and don't succeed in doing so. But I think that it should. And so I'm interested to see where Kong is taken in the next couple of years.
Yeah, one of the points you made in the first part of the video that I found, that like obviously it's there, but I hadn't even thought about it, but is like Fay Ray is like put forth as like, well, this is a more desirable female sacrifice than the one we were going to do, us here native to Skull Island. And it's like, it's in whether the filmmakers even thought about it or not. At the time, it was just sort of implying, well, yeah, white women are far more desirable to, scary Black men effectively than their own Black women. Like it was just, it's wild. And it was just like, it blew my mind. I was just like, of course that's what this is saying. And it did this, like the one in 76, which was also quite popular. It just kind of goes, well, Jessica Lange just lives there. Isn't that different? It's like, no, it's not. It's the same.
It's not.
And I think to your point about, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm going to say in her like sacrifice scene, which again, the fact that the human sacrifice thing is crazy in general, is that's the movie where she's like dressed, like they strip her of her normal clothing and put her in their like quote unquote native, attire that is incredibly problematic. And Dwan. I know that's her character.
Yeah.
Not Dawn, Dwan.
Dwan, yeah. They dress her like Wilma Flintstone, and so that's completely fine.
And I think that just shows, like, says everything you need to know about how a lot of people saw Kong, is like it's this caricature stereotype, and that they're somehow these native peoples are like back in time, like prehistoric, because their world doesn't look like ours. And it's a lot.
Yeah, and I really don't think like there's having reverence for the original, which is what clearly Peter Jackson does, but he I mean, the fact that movie is like 3 times the length of the original is one thing, but he doesn't do anything to like interrogate a lot of those things. He just kind of does it again and just spends a little more time with Emily Watson. Right? Who is this?
Naomi Watts.
Naomi Watts.
Think,
there's too many Wattses out there. Naomi Watts. Thank you. As she just gets to spend time with Kong and make him
Mhm.
laugh and stuff like that. And the fact that they go ice skating is
It's
ridiculous.
ridiculous.
Um,
But
but it's
that
like,
is
it's
the
still
first one where he's, like, the lonely, like,
yeah.
battle-scarred, like, anti-hero, and that's kind of the first sort of inkling or the first time they more explicitly get into, like, he's the last of his species is kind of implied, and of course that, narrative wouldn't happen until, the launch of the Godzilla, movies in the last
Mhm.
decade, but I think that he's meant to be more sympathetic, and I do think that's something that Jackson tried to do to address some of the problematic racial stereotypes placed on Kong previously. But as you said, again, it's still the beautiful white woman who's like saving Kong, which is incredibly problematic. And he's still taken from his
Yeah.
home country and put on display, which of course, and for profit, which mirrors the actual enslaved experience. So that's still there.
Yeah. And there's that joke in Inglorious Bastards too. Do you remember that? Did you
No, I
remember
don't.
that? Okay, so they're playing that, whatever that card game or that game is, where you put the name of somebody on your head and you're supposed
Uh-huh.
to guess who you are. Well, somebody is King Kong, and they're listing all the things about him,
Oh
and
my
then he
god.
goes, "Oh, I'm the plight of the American black slave," and they're like, "No," and he's like, "Oh, then I'm King Kong." And it's like, oh
Got it.
boy,
Yeah.
howdy.
Yeah. And that's where I
um,
think so maybe that's just shows, like, how ingrained that we have recognized, or a lot of people have recognized that Kong, the original Kong movie, definitely has problematic things to it,
yes.
and it's okay to talk about those problems. We don't have to ignore it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was just like you said. It was a product of its time. We have to talk about it both ways. Like we
Mhm,
we have to say that this was not good, but it was what happened, and so
mhm.
like can't cut it out. Like I remember just randomly like watching a Fred Astaire movie where he like puts on blackface, and it was just
Yeah.
like, all right, well, this is a thing we have to look at because like that's what they did. So, um, yeah, but I think Kong as a I think Kong is inherently, at least in the new versions of them,
Mhm,
like inherently more sympathetic um in a lot of ways. And I do think that, like, if we look at Godzilla versus Kong, which is the one that came out a few years ago,
mhm,
um even though it's a draw technically, Kong's is the fact, I think Kong's the main character of that movie, or at least of
mhm,
the main monster of that movie, and
mhm,
Godzilla is much more the antagonist,
mhm.
which was actually fairly surprising considering I think that Godzilla is by far more popular as a character than Kong is.
I would think so too. And I think again that might be, as you mentioned earlier when we in our discussion, part of it is maybe we find it a little bit easier to identify with Kong because of, the ape connection,
Right.
being so close to us in species. And Godzilla being more reptilian and dinosaur, and that seems very foreign to us.
Hmm.
Also, we have to talk about the fact that Kong like has an axe now, like he has a weapon, so he's humanized in that way too. But I think that maybe they're making Kong, like, the champion of humanity because but still allowing Godzilla to, like, recognize, like we said, like, this is just nature, and Kong
Yeah.
definitely has at least appears to have, more emotional, capabilities and understanding, and I think that, one thing that I liked, again, about Kong Skull Island is in some ways it rewrote Kong's relationship with humanity and also with women. Brie Larson's character in that, I just rewatched it obviously for the episode, and instead of like being taken by her beauty, and that's like the thing that he pays attention to, he sees her try to help another animal. And that's like, he's okay. Like we have like a mutual respect thing going on. And so they didn't even have to put in that problematic narrative of him being like in a relationship with a woman because she's beautiful and white or whatever. It's like, oh, look, you're
Yeah.
trying to protect too, and that's what I want to do. And I think maybe that's where audiences also identify with Kong more than Godzilla, is at least in the more recent movies. It's like we see Kong trying to help humans, and I guess the positive reading is like maybe that will inspire us to try to help one another or at least help nature. The fact that he goes into the Hollow Earth, I have so many thoughts about. And I'm curious to see what the new movie does with that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Mothra, because we both love
Yes.
Mothra. The first Mothra, Mothra, I think I maybe knew about as a concept before Godzilla
Mhm,
somehow.
mhm,
But the first Mothra movie, she, misunderstood much more so than Godzilla, but still attacks, still destroys a lot of things, but right away is positioned as the hero. Like
mhm,
for Mothra versus Godzilla, and then Ghidra the three-headed monster, it is Mothra who is the out and out hero of those movies, and Godzilla is in the first one the villain, and then in the second one a reluctant like, oh, I guess I'll fight against
Yeah.
this alien monster. And it's a giant moth. Like I
I
just
love
would
it.
never have, because you know, like moths kind of creep me out, like just
Okay.
as bugs. But Mothra obviously doesn't. What if I was scared of Mothra?
I mean, I feel like some people are. I mean, because like you said,
Maybe,
some people are
maybe,
freaked out by moths. I think moths are cool, and I think moths are cool because I'm obsessed with Mothra. And
maybe. Yeah.
I definitely knew about Godzilla before I knew about Mothra. And just I think I was rewatching like the old films or something, and she pops up, and I was like, she is a boss queen, and I'm obsessed with her. And like you said from the
Hmm.
very beginning, and she actually there was a book that came out about her before the movie. She is immediately like a goddess who is worshipped as benevolent and a helper to humanity, like full stop. And so when you have someone like that, yeah, a moth does seem like very. I love that. And I love that Mothra is so powerful and is able to defeat Godzilla at different points, like throughout the kaiju history, because you would think that this um, Godzilla would be no match for this, or, would clearly be able to dominate this, soft winged, like ethereal, aerial creature. And the opposite is true. And I think that that's so interesting to look at, not only as a comment on like feminism, because she is like the female kaiju, at least in my mind. Um,
Hmm.
I think that's really interesting that there's like a part of her strength comes from the fact that she is kind. And I think that's just really cool. And, she can like make more of herself. And that whole thing is interesting. But I
Yeah.
love
I mean, I love the fact that Mothra is a main character of Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster, or Ghidorah, I guess, as most
Mhm.
people say. I grew up saying Ghidra.
Yeah.
But is in caterpillar form the whole time. Like
Mhm.
it's like doesn't need to be full
No,
Mothra to still be Mothra.
like
And
swimming in the ocean in
yeah,
larva form. Love it.
oh god, I love those shots of just like it's like a speedboat, like just like
Yeah.
going over the waves. It's really great. But I also really like the what do they call them in the fairies, essentially, that
Yeah.
are her emissaries.
Mhm.
And how just immediately with her, it's like it's not science anymore.
Mhm.
It's not ancient history. There's an element of like whimsy and fantasy
Mhm.
that when they brought them all together, obviously the three-headed monster is alien. So that was like, all right, everything is coalescing all at once. But I think that's a huge part of like the appeal of Mothra
Mhm.
for me, is that she is a creature who is magical in some fashion,
Mhm.
but it's not like a thing we don't actually have. It's like just a giant version of a thing we have.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think that when we compare like that team up too of Godzilla and Mothra, is we almost have the like science, nature Godzilla, and then we have the folkloric, mythical, beautiful Mothra. And I think there's something really profound in having those two things combine is what's able to sort of defeat the alien. And again, maybe that's just me coming as someone who I guess combines science and myth in my work on a regular basis. But I think that's really cool. And honestly, I would like to see more of that in the more modern iterations.
Yeah, as would I. And Mothra appeared quite a bit, obviously, in the movies.
Mhm.
There's a trilogy of movies they made in, I believe, the early 2000s, that are unrelated to the Godzilla
Hmm.
movies. But I've never seen them, but I really want to, and they're really hard to find in the U.S. So if anybody
Yeah,
if anybody knows where I can watch them, please let me know.
let us know.
But um, yeah, like what do you think? What are some of your thoughts on just some of the other, like obviously Rodan is another one that
Mhm.
kind of came up from the Toho school, but they were trying to do that with all sorts of creatures, like obviously Daiei Studios was doing Gamera, and just
Mhm.
like after Godzilla there was like a glut. Even King Kong was a Toho movie.
Yeah.
Frankenstein's monster was a kaiju for a while. Like
Mhm.
what is your take on that kind of obsession with, and even, and you mentioned them as well as
Mhm.
a different version of it. Why are we obsessed with giant monsters?
Giant monsters. I think part of it is because, especially even just the examples that you named, right? Even Godzilla looks like something that kind of exists, like
Hmm.
reptilian enough that we're like familiar with it. And I think that again, maybe it's recognition of that there are so many actual natural species out there in the world that are more powerful than us humans, and that's like hard for us to process. So like let's size them up so they seem even more of a threat. Um, I think that might be part of it, especially something like Mothra, or even King Kong. Like gorillas are terrifying.
Mm.
They're incredibly strong and like incredibly sensitive, and there's not really a lot of evidence that they've ever intentionally hurt humans consistently. But we don't want to acknowledge. I think. I mean, we look at them in zoos.
Hmm.
and like they're stronger than us in a lot of ways. So I think that kaiju films, and yeah, even the big bug subgenre is about taking something that we already have a little bit of fear of and blowing it up. And I think that in blowing it up to this gargantuan size allows us to sort of infuse more meaning into those things and allows for a lot more of those political or social or cultural commentaries, because they are larger than life. So they can talk about these sort of massive problems or things that are happening in our world. But also, I think that's the fact that like it looks cool. I mean, it
Yep.
is, and I think part of that maybe does come back because I mean, PBS has another show, Eons, which is fantastic. But people are obsessed with dinosaurs, and I think part of the reason for that obsession, at least from my perspective, is that it's incredible to think that there were creatures that were so much larger than us walking
Yeah.
around on Earth. And that if we were able to like take those things like Jurassic Park and put them back in our modern world, like what would that mean? We would cease to exist because we aren't as powerful. And I think that that's in a way what the Godzilla and King Kong movies to a degree like remind us of is we are not actually the apex predators. Um, Technology might make us appear that way, but if we were to strip us of that, we would not come out on top.
It's I find it because I've loved them forever, but like if you just really look at it, boy, there's a lot of like collateral damage in these movies.
Yeah.
Like even if they're not trying to attack people, like or destroy cities, it's just like they can't help
Destroying
but do
stuff.
it. Like
Yeah, and I
there's
think
yeah.
so that's for me why I think kaiju movies at their core are all about the tension between technology and nature. They're, either usually brought to existence or, come from their deep slumber because of some kind of technology that humans invent, or they're destroying technology left and right. Even in the opening scene of the Godzilla versus Kong movie, it's Kong like throwing a tree at his like containment dome, being like frustrated, and the characters are talking about like it's not going to hold him much longer. And I think that that is a very obvious reminder of what kaiju films stand for. Again, at their core, which is like nature is we can't control it,
Mm.
and that may be asking if we should even be trying to.
Um Mecha Godzilla, I think, is
Yeah.
something we also should talk about, which is well, depending on the version you watch. Sometimes
Hmm.
it's aliens, sometimes it's humans, but making a version that is trying to do that exact thing to control the nature at all. And I guess Pacific Rim maybe did the same thing where
Yeah.
it's like, let's build these giant. Well, I mean, that was just like cool to see robots
Yeah.
fight monsters, but um, what do you think? Like, why did it take so long? First of all,
Yeah.
because I think it was into the late '70s or the mid '70s, I guess, by the time they actually introduced a robot to fight Godzilla.
That's
But
a really good point. I think maybe it seems I'm about ridiculous enough to say it's like out of this world, like too far out
uh-huh.
of the realm of possibility. Whereas I think people were more used to this, like narrative of aliens or things being brought back to life from other time periods. Like that was very much like had a long pop culture history already, where there's been automatons and lots of commentary on robotics and mechanics, but I don't think it really gained a lot of traction until like the mid 20th century, in a lot of ways because it became more permeating in culture. As it became easier to make these things, we saw them more often, and we can, I think, more easily speculate what they could do. And one of the things I love to remind people about is that science fiction has accurately predicted some of the technologies that we have in the world today. So who knows? I mean, I hope there's not going to be some, mecha Godzilla type creature that's controlled or possessed by a dead, like Titan alien. But I mean, hey, maybe,
We can only hope
right?
that that's not going to happen. But I mean, Japan has been trying to make a Gundam, a real life Gundam, for a really long
It's
time.
wild. Yeah.
The fact that there's one that can walk forward and walk back is like pretty scary in and of itself. Like,
I yeah, I see this comes back to my fear of robots. Even those like, well, a lot of implications for it, like the war dogs are
mm,
terrifying to watch.
oh
And
yeah, I don't like those at all.
yeah, I'm surprised that we haven't seen a big, and I'm sure someone's going to point out, correct me, that I'm sure there's been some obscure text that I haven't heard of, like bugs, like combining like our fear of like big bugs with like AI and robots, because it would be really easy um, for insects to take over if they had some kind of robot technology.
I think the first time I ever heard a science teacher or somebody say that like insects outnumber humans by 7 billion to 1 or whatever the number was, and just being like, oh, and everyone's just okay with all of
Yeah,
this,
like, well, I guess we have to be, which is what it comes down
yeah,
to, right? Is like we have to be. And I think that's what horror and science fiction do so brilliantly is force us to confront some of those realities. If that's, racism with King Kong, if that's the use of atomic weapons on humans with Godzilla, or if that's, big bug films in, urbanization and white flight, then we're allowed to talk about those things in horror because it's like a creative space that I think, can speculate and push boundaries. And I think it's always been that way. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about science fiction and horror.
Before I let you go, I have a couple of just nerdy fan questions.
Please.
What is your favorite, besides the first one, which I think we can both agree is the best one? What is your favorite of the Godzilla movies?
Ooh. Yeah, the first one definitely takes the cake, as you said.
It's a masterpiece. Like, it's truly a masterpiece.
I really didn't mind the 21st century reboot. What year was that? Was that just like Godzilla?
2014.
Yeah, 2014. I thought that it did a lot of cool things and sort of brought Godzilla into the modern world while paying homage to some of the original Godzilla stuff that I really enjoyed. So that one's up there for me. And I'm going to say Godzilla King of the Monsters just because Mothra. She looks so good. I mean, whoever did the character design for Mothra and like the newer iterations, I mean, she's beautiful from the get-go. And I just am obsessed for that reason.
When I love the fact that she has much more in the newer ones, like much more articulated, I guess, like legs and arms and things like that. Looks much more like an actual moth.
Not like a puppet.
Not like a puppet, yeah. I don't know, man. I like the puppet. I think it's fun.
She's fuzzy and like cute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is toyetic to the max.
Yeah.
Like you just want to hug Mothra. What is your favorite monster movie divorced of Godzilla and kaiju? Like, what is just your favorite go-to monster movie?
Go-to monster movie? I'm completely blanking on the Cloverfield. I really like Cloverfield.
Oh, yeah.
So it is kaiju at its core, but Cloverfield, I think, did something really cool with kaiju films, like with the point of view sort of horror stuff that was going on too. So Cloverfield was probably up there for me in terms of monster movies.
That was speaking of like gigantophobia, that was a movie that like I had to kind of like look away from while watching because it was just like, it's too big. It's like
too much.
Just creepy.
But I also am a fan of like the sharksploitation films because I think sharks are just honestly really cute in a lot of ways. And I think the history of shark films is really fun. So Jaws, of course. I mean, it inspired a lot of cinema for a reason.
Oh yeah. And they just keep putting sharks in weird places. Yes. I think there's a movie that you can watch called Sharks of the Corn or something like that. Like it's literally combining Children of the Corn and sharks.
That's too funny.
Yeah. So obviously you know a lot about Dracula. Who do you think was the best Dracula?
I think actually Nosferatu is the best adaptation of Dracula because it's the closest to the original. So that's just I want to see another. I was really disappointed by the last Voyage of the Demeter. I had high hopes.
Me too.
I had high hopes for that Dracula, and he was way too bat-like. And I want like the Nosferatu Dracula. Like, give me the original Bram Stoker Dracula.
Yeah, I have no problem with it being kind of more, bestial, I suppose. But like, it still needs to be like speak. Like, we need to understand. Like, I like the old Hammer movies, the old British ones with Christopher Lee, and I do enjoy those movies for all their aesthetic. But like, he has almost no lines, and it's like Dracula is such an interesting character to converse with.
Yes, that's like the point. And he's been alive for so long, and he can seduce anyone, anywhere. It's fascinating.
If you were to become a monster in any fashion, would it be a Dracula? That's what I almost said. Would it be a vampire?
See, I've actually been asked this before, and I never have like an appropriate answer at the time. I think that there's something appealing about being some kind of undead being, not the whole, having to feed on other humans.
Right.
But it's like the double-edged sword, right? Is that it would be cool to get to experience more than one lifetime, but also really depressing to see people that you care about not be able to have that experience. I think if I was going to become a monster, I'd probably be Ghost or Fae folk.
I mean, that's more fun. I would do fae folk.
Yeah.
Ghosts to me seem like, well, the best. I love ghost movies, and it's because there's an element of sadness to all of them, or there ought to be, and so I just don't want to be sad forever. So that's why
that's actually valid. Yeah. So fae folk would be cool. I guess if I was going to be a ghost, a banshee, at least you could kind of help people by warning them of death.
Yeah. Oh man, Irish folklore, the best.
I know.
Has the best stuff in it. Changelings, all that kind of
so good
stuff. Dr. Emily Zarka, thank you so much for being here to talk about giant monsters and movies and things like that. How can people get a hold of you and your work on the internet should they choose to do so?
So you can find all the latest episodes of MONSTRUM and all the ones we've done in all 6 seasons on the Storied channel on YouTube. You can also find me on Instagram at MONSTRUM PBS and also at Dr. Emily Zarka. But yeah, feel free to stay in touch. I love to hear from fans and fellow horror enthusiasts alike.
Absolutely. If you want to send me a message here at the show, you can do laserfocus at nerdist.com. You can follow me on Instagram, functional_nerd. It's an old name. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd. I love talking about movies and stuff on there now that certain hellscapes have made me go elsewhere. But you can follow me there at Kyle_Anderson. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Zarka, for joining me on the show. And join me again next week when my guest will be a different person. Bye-bye. Laser Focus is a production of Nerdist Industries and Legendary Digital Networks. It was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Kyle Anderson. For more, visit nerdist.com.